Hi, everyone. We're just coming up to the hour. We'll be starting soon. I'm delighted to have so many of you join. We had a number sign up in the last few minutes, and it seems one of the characteristics now is that we're all so busy that we make the decisions at the last minute. So I'm absolutely delighted that some of you made that decision. Also glad to see so many of you come back and join us for this our webinar on demonstrating self-awareness, sponsored by Clinton HR and presented by myself for Want to Be Great. This is one of 52 management competencies which were derived from observations, research, and analysis, which all really good people managers demonstrate to a good standard. So I'm delighted to share this with you. During a survey we conducted in late 2018, this was identified as one of the top 10 competencies that C-suite executives believed managers need to develop further. And it's certainly become a hot topic over the last year, and especially over the last 3 months. Over the last year and over the last 3 months, we've seen the destructive power that lack of self-awareness can have. We've seen it in world leaders, without wishing to name anyone. We've seen it in domestic politicians. We've seen it in companies. We've seen it through the PR from companies. And during the COVID-19 crisis, we saw how Sir Richard Branson got attacked for some of the things that he said, clearly not aware of how that was going to be interpreted. Similarly, Victoria Beckham, we've seen publicity coming out from BA, and more recently, a tweet coming from Bristol Gin. And as managers, we need to be really aware of how we affect each others. I'm Clinton Wingrove. I've spent nearly 4 decades looking at the behavioral engineering aspects of organizations. How do individuals interact with each other? What triggers different responses? And how can we improve those? So I'm delighted to be sharing with you a lot of the things I've learned, and I continue to learn on this particular topic. It's really important, though, to spot what the value is, because we are all under pressure to learn so many things. And one of the things that I've noticed is that self-awareness can really have some positive spin-offs. At a very simple level, people who are very self-aware frequently are known to be happier. Why? They're more contented. They know who they are, they know what they are, and they make choices about how to respond. At the other end of the spectrum, I work with senior executives on their persuasion skills and on high-level negotiation skills. And self-awareness is absolutely critical if you want to improve, enhance, and use your persuasion skills. And on a very simple level, it's really important for developing relationships. And now that many of us are working remotely, have staff working for us remotely, or we work remotely for a boss, building relationships is that much more difficult. We're now starting to understand the negative impacts of working with virtual tools, the tiredness that it creates, and therefore the sensitivity to other people. So self-awareness is critically important. We often think of self-awareness as being the ability to look in a mirror. And of course, it is really important that you can actually sit back and look at yourself. But one of the things we're learning right now with Black Lives Matter, with the recent emphasis on pride, with emphasis before that on feminism, is that it's incredibly difficult for all of us to actually see ourselves as other people see us. And this is part of self-awareness. It's why it's an issue that we need to spend some time consciously thinking about. Yeah, first of all, can we see ourselves for what we are? But secondly, can we see ourselves for how other people see us? And of course, they tend to view us through filters, through different lenses. We have filters ourselves. We have unconscious biases which trick us into making decisions, doing things, etc., that other people view and interpret differently. So if for self-awareness, it's critically important that we have a really good grasp about a number of things. Firstly, we need to understand how we feel and why we feel certain ways, because emotions are very, very powerful drivers of how we act. And of course, it's our actions that other people see. We also need to understand how we think, how we make decisions, how we go about deciding what are we going to do and the ways in which we're going to do it. Because again, that has a dramatic impact on other people. And we also need to understand what we actually do. And that may sound very strange. And you may be thinking, well, of course I know what I do. My experience working with executives that I'm coaching is very often they don't know what they do. Lots of our behaviors are triggered by our unconscious brain. And just for a very simple example, which I often use when I'm training people in unconscious bias, many of you before the lockdown will have probably been driving to work, and you'll be passing through traffic lights, none of which, when you get to work, you can recall ever having seen. And it's because your unconscious brain has developed patterns, you've mastered skills, you do things without thinking. You are literally not conscious of what you do. But as managers, we need to be very conscious of what we do, because every single action we take is being observed by other people and having an impact on them. And this is why so many organizations, for example, are investing time working with managers on how their actions affect the well-being of their staff. So let's just look at a long list of the things that we need to be self-aware of. And let me just highlight a few. Firstly, it's obvious that we need to know what our level of knowledge is, what our level of skill is, and the behaviors that we are typically demonstrating on a day-to-day basis. But there's an increasing sense now that we also need to understand a little more. We need to understand our personal beliefs, and we need to understand our values. And there's some fabulous work on this topic by Simon Sinek out on TED.com, probably one of the leading authorities in the topic. But many of us are not really consciously aware of what our beliefs and values are, particularly in relation to our staff, how we should be interacting with them, how we should respond to them. And again, we're being challenged during this crisis to think about what are our beliefs and values. Do we believe that our staff should get up and be at work at 9 o'clock and work till 5 o'clock? Do we believe that staff should answer emails if we send them to them at 11 o'clock at night? Do we believe that if a customer has a question, a member of staff should pick it up even if it's the weekend? Do we believe that staff should put aside the personal circumstances that they have at home so that they can work, despite the fact that their children can't go to school, etc.? And many of us are beginning to see how important understanding those things are for making it possible for us to build an intelligent and a robust relationship with staff. And then there's things like our personality. I frequently work with people, taking them through just a simple psychometric. Many of you I know because I'm knowing many of you individually. So I know many of you are familiar with psychometrics like DISC, Insights, Myers-Briggs, Hogan, Papikostic, LIFO, 16PF. There's a number of really useful tools that can help us to understand what our preferences are in a very structured way so that we can start to be more conscious of how we impact people. So, for example, on the DISC profile, I score very high on I and on S. That means that I tend to be very outgoing. I'm enthusiastic, but it also means I question whether changes are really appropriate and necessary. I want to make sure that if we're going to change things, they're changed for the good. That helps me to understand how I approach a problem, which might be different to how someone else does. So it helps me to understand why they may look at me with those glassy eyes at different points. And that takes us to things like likes and dislikes. I mentioned Papikostic, which is a preference inventory, looks at the preferred roles that we fill and so on. And then what do we find easy and what do we find difficult? We'll find if you're really self-aware, you'll understand that you're likely to do the things that you find easy first, and you're likely to do them best. The things that you find difficult, you're likely to do last or procrastinate over, and you're likely to become progressively worse rather than progressively better. Having a clear understanding of what we actually find easy and difficult, taking that time out to think it through, can significantly impact our efficiency and effectiveness and use of time. Also, looking at the needs that we have out of work and life in general. Many people end up in a job which, for good or bad reason, doesn't suit them. And frequently, they don't think through what it is they need out of work and out of life, and can stay in that job and progressively experience stress, which can then mean that it's harder for them to change because their performance starts to deteriorate. And it's always easier to get promoted if you're good at what you currently do and enjoy it. And then understanding the roles you like to play and avoid. I've come across many, many examples when I'm coaching teams, and I do a reasonable amount of senior management team coaching. And in meetings, it's blatantly obvious, usually to everybody apart from the individual, when people don't want to step up and take on a project, when they don't want to contribute to the team, when they don't want to go along with the collective decision that's being proposed. So how clear are you about the types of roles that you welcome and the types of roles that you avoid? Are you conscious, or is this again unconscious behavior? And then people you work well with and those you don't. It's increasingly important that we develop our networking skills. When we were all going into the office and we were all doing networking meetings and we were all having nights out together and so on, bonding with people was relatively easy. Now it's much more difficult. And there's a serious danger that if there are people that we need to have good relationships with, where that doesn't come naturally, in a remote and virtual world, we are without realizing it, we are probably going to lose those connections because the informal connections won't arise. We have to do it deliberately. And then on our strengths and limitations, we may be aware of our relative strengths and limitations, but are we aware of the standard that they reflect? Because every single one of us is relatively good at some things and relatively less good at other things. But the question is, on an absolute scale, are we good enough for the role that we want to fill, for the tasks that we have to handle? So again, how are we handling that? And then what motivates and demotivates us? People with a very high level of self-awareness find it much easier to control their personal emotions and how they feel, because they know what motivates and demotivates, and looking at the next one, what excites and upsets them. And many years ago, I worked with a psychologist from Los Angeles in California. And she did a lot of work with myself and a number of senior execs in the company I was with, showing us how it's possible, if you really understand what motivates and demotivates yourself, how easy it is to quickly change your emotional mood. She used to say to me, Clint, you can choose how you feel. Initially, I thought she was a complete lunatic, but after a few weeks of working with her, I realized the more I understood what pushed my buttons, what got me going, what turned me off, it was much easier then to control those responses. And it was also much easier to put myself in a position that would enable me to engineer the type of feeling I wanted. And then lastly, let me touch on unconscious biases. I'm being asked by a lot of companies at the moment to run training for their managers in what unconscious bias is, how you can detect it, how you can evaluate it, and how you can respond to it. Because our unconscious biases cause all of those emotions, as I said, that we don't think about. And they can trigger actions, they trigger thoughts, they trigger decisions. If you want to know a little bit more about unconscious bias, there are some free tests that you can take, which were developed by two psychologists. They're called the Harvard Implicit Association Tests, or IATs, Harvard Implicit Association Tests. If you do that search in your browser, you'll take you to a website, and there's a raft of tests you can take that will give you an insight into unconscious biases. Why do those matter, you might ask? Well, let me give you a personal example. I took the unconscious bias test that looks at potential bias in relation to age. And I was really surprised that I came out demonstrating a very strong bias towards younger people. The implication being that if I was faced with a decision, let's say on promotion, on pay, on development opportunities, I would unconsciously be biased towards giving it to younger people in my staff rather than older people. I was really surprised because I've always prided myself on not being inappropriately biased. So, having been statistically trained, I went back and I studied all the decisions I could recollect over the prior 10 years. So pay decisions, promotion decisions, giving people the opportunity to travel, giving them projects they could work on. I listed out as many as I could think of. And then I went back and categorized them into the different age bands. I basically broke it down into 4 categories. And much to my relief, I found that actually there was no bias at all. Compared to the mix of people that I could have chosen from, it was a good representation, no indication of statistical bias. So I discussed it with my coach and I said, perhaps these Harvard IATs are not valid. And I've just seen a question mark here from John. John saying, should be able to hear me speaking. Yes, you should, John. I've actually got the microphone on, and according to my signals here, it is transmitting the sound. So going back to my scenario, so my coach said, well, the fact that your decisions don't display a bias towards age doesn't mean to say that you don't have one. And I said, what do you mean? And my coach said, what I want you to do is go back and study all of those decisions. And if you can, recollect how difficult or how easy they were to make. When I did, I was quite astonished. All of the ones where I'd chosen the younger people, I clearly recollect them being, let's call it, obvious decisions. When I looked at the ones where I'd chosen more people in the older age categories, particularly the upper 2, the upper half, what I found was those were ones either where I recall a tortuous decision, or somebody, typically my manager or superior, had greatly influenced me. So what I started to realize is yes, I do have that unconscious bias, and it so happens that I've managed to overcome it. But now I'm aware of it, that's much, much easier to do. So again, I recommend that you might want to consider looking at that. So let's look then at the 4 behaviors, or the 4 anchor behaviors in demonstrating self-awareness. And demonstrating self-awareness is one of the elements, one of the 52 competencies in the Quaternion people management profile. By the way, we will drop all of you or attend an email afterwards sharing a copy of that. We'll also provide you with a copy of the slide deck, and we'll also provide you with a link to the recording. So the first behavior, the first anchor behavior, and the 4 anchor behaviors for demonstrating self-awareness. The first one is seeks and responds to feedback from others, acknowledges own limitations without making excuses. That takes a number of components, or a number of different dimensions. The first one is people who are really good at demonstrating self-awareness are very good at actually asking for feedback. They do it explicitly, but they also do it implicitly. So explicitly, clearly, if I'm in a meeting, I might ask, is there anything else I can do to help? Might be as simple as that. It might be, would anybody like to give me feedback on how I made that presentation? But people who are really good at demonstrating self-awareness are also very good at asking in other ways. They're very good at maintaining eye contact and smiling. And maintaining eye contact and smiling encourages people to give you feedback. They're very good at adopting a posture that's non-aggressive. So they will actually stand back. They don't invade your personal space. So people who are very good at demonstrating self-awareness seek it, not only explicitly, but they also ask for it in the way in which they interact with you. And that even happens on virtual conferences. So people who are really self-aware will spend a lot more time looking at the camera and encouraging through those visual transmissions people to interact. Secondly, people who are really good at demonstrating self-awareness in this particular behavior are very good at observing. They're very good at observing feedback. And of course, a lot of feedback we get is not actually verbal. It comes from body language. So when we make a presentation, seeing how people respond, do they look tired, bored, and falling asleep? Do they look excited? Do they look inspired? When we interact with them and share an idea with them, do they ask questions, etc.? And observing those interactions is a really powerful way of developing your own self-awareness. Listening for the tonality and listening for how people respond to your tonality in voice. Another way I find as well, one of the questions I often ask senior managers is, how often do you get invited to the meetings that you'd like to go to, rather than you have to ask if you can attend? And those might be formal meetings, they might be informal meetings. How often are you copied on information, and how often do you have to go and find it? And when you send information out or you give information, what sort of responses do you get? People who are self-aware take time to observe those things. It informs them, therefore, on how they are being perceived by others. And then one of the most powerful, and I remember covering this on one of the webinars we shared earlier, those of you who attended the Want to Be Great webinar, where we talked about taking control of your own development. And I mentioned that journaling is a really powerful tool. Most successful executives keep journals. It's a posh word for a diary. They just make notes of what's happened during the day. They make notes of the people they've interacted with, but they make notes as well as to how those interactions went, what they said, the response that they got. And then they take time to sit and reflect. They review those past interactions. They review their past decisions. And what they start to get a better understanding of is what they are bringing to those interactions. They start to spot patterns. So in my case, if I'd done that more rigorously, I would have started to spot the pattern that I was finding it easier to choose the newer employees than I was the more long-serving elderly ones. And it's a skill, actually. I'm quite embarrassed that I didn't realize this, because many, many years ago, I worked with some exceptional sales managers, and they used to be passionate about what they called the curbside conference. And this was where coming out of a sales call, they would immediately just sit in the car at the curbside and reflect on what went well. What did we say? How did they respond to it? What did they ask? How did we respond to it? And what they were doing was they were actually learning how they had handled the sales calls. So they were increasing their self-awareness, ready for future situations. The second part of that one behavior is also this issue of response. Yeah. How do you personally respond when you get feedback? Yeah. Do you react? In other words, the instant it arrives, there's an immediate response. And a lot of people these days say, we live in a fast world, everything is highly reactive. Yes, it is. The current world is highly reactive, and we see some of the negative effects that has on social media, where people see a post, they don't like it, and they immediately express their opinion, often to regret it afterwards. Well, the same is true when we're managers. When we're on a conference call, perhaps with our staff, or on a video conference call, and we're pressurized under time, do we react to how they say things? Do we react to feedback they give us? Or do we instead take time to think? And what we found is that the people who are really effective, the really effective people managers, they are much better at responding to feedback than actually reacting. So they acknowledge the feedback, they make a note of it, sometimes they even thank people for it, but they take time, even if it's only a few seconds. They take time to process that feedback and look for the positive. They look for the learning in the feedback. That then enables them to give a more constructive response. And what you typically find is that we build in organizations, we build even in companies, we build in countries, we build rules and laws to try to get people to act in the way that we want them to, and we want them to respond to that. So our feedback is, this is the new law. Our feedback is, it's now a 1 meter distance or a 2 meter. That's going to be coming at some time soon. And we expect people to abide by it. The problem is, very often people react. And if they react, it's unconscious and it's not thinking. If people respond, typically we are tapping into the hearts and minds. So when you seek feedback, when you're given feedback, do you take that time to shift from a react mode, which is instant, unconscious, to a conscious mode where you can evaluate the feedback, set it in a context, and make more use of it? And of course, some of the troubles that we're currently facing are because we frequently act purely out of unconscious behavior, thought, rather than conscious. And we're now all being encouraged to think far more carefully about how we treat people, particularly at the moment of different ethnic origins, etc. And then acknowledge his own limitations without making excuses. I can remember when I was at school, which is clearly only a few years ago, one of my teachers saying, Wingrove, humility is a virtue invented for people without talent. And at the time, we all thought that was really amusing. What we're now beginning to realize is the power of humility. People who are able to step back and acknowledge their limitations demonstrably now build greater trust. Some of you may have attended the webinar I ran on super teams, the power that respect has. One way of driving respect is very much to acknowledge your own limitations, to recognize people when they give you feedback. It enables you to build trust. So that's a really important piece that we need to adopt. Getting feedback and merely responding on a clinical or an analytical level does not quite achieve what can be achieved if you're able to demonstrate that humility and without making excuses. And when I say making excuses, I don't mean necessarily putting forward evidence. We can make excuses by saying things like, yeah, I can understand why you might say that. Well, what I'm doing is I'm dismissing the feedback. I'm saying, well, I can understand why you might say that, but I don't agree with it. Or we say, oh yes, well, of course, you triggered me to say that when you mentioned the cost cutting. Well, I've now in a sense weakened my acceptance of the feedback I got. So humility is about being open and not making any excuses, explicit or implicit. The next behavior that we see in anchor behavior was demonstrates awareness of how they're perceived by others and of the impact that they have with them. And I think probably one of the best examples we've seen recently is Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who has taken some immensely courageous decisions. She's been quite analytical, evidence-based, and taken really tough decisions. But in the way in which she's communicated them, she's clearly demonstrated how she will be perceived as the Prime Minister. She's demonstrated empathy. She's explained in a cool, rational way. She's used very simple to understand language. She's not used the type of language or approach that I'm certain she had to use to achieve those decisions within her cabinet meetings. So it's about demonstrating that awareness. So again, I find very senior executives will frequently turn up in a meeting, either physical or virtual, and demonstrate no comprehension of the fact that their seniority itself intimidates other people. Likewise, if you're known to be someone acutely skilled at handling detail, be aware that if you are attending a presentation by someone junior who's presenting charts and figures, they will be consciously thinking about when you're going to jump on them and grill them. If you're known to be someone who's reticent, be aware that that's likely to trigger people to ask you questions. So thinking about how you're likely to be perceived by others, and then just demonstrating that in the way you enter the conversation, the way in which you ask them questions, the meetings that you attend, etc., can have a dramatic impact on the strength of the connection you'll make with them. And that takes us then to adapting, which is the third behavior within the 4 anchors. So people who demonstrate high self-awareness are very skilled at adapting how they work to account for their own strengths and limitations. And that doesn't always mean fixing them. As Marcus Buckingham said, in many organizations, we put the majority of people in rehabilitation because what we focus them on is the weaknesses that they've got and ask them to fix them. And what Marcus Buckingham has demonstrated very powerfully is the importance of focusing on strengths. That doesn't mean to say you ignore your weaknesses. It just means you don't obsess about them. So people who demonstrate very high levels of self-awareness are very good at identifying what their strengths and limitations are and then adapting their behavior to suit. So they play to their strengths, but they're quite happy. And remember, I mentioned humility earlier. So if they've got a level of humility, irrespective of their seniority, they will seek help. They will ask help on things that they know they're not good at. They will actively involve other people. Often people who are surprised, astonished to be asked. They don't try to be all things to all people. And what we've learned over certainly the research I've done over the last 12 years into excellence in people management, what I've discovered is people who are excellent at people management set out to be great, but they don't set out to be great at everything. They set out to be good at all the things they need to be good at and great at the ones that they're particularly good at. And they're quite willing to actually adapt the way they work so that the limitations that they have do not have an adverse effect. And as I say, that typically means they'll actively involve others, or as I did on 2 occasions, they change their role. They move into an arena where the mix of their skills and relative limitations work more effectively. And that takes us to the 4th behavior. And the 4th anchor behavior is admitting their mistakes and learning from them. It's clearly demonstrable now, again, in the research we've been doing, that people with very high levels of self-awareness actually are very good at admitting their mistakes. What that means is that also there is a corollary, that they also don't blame other people. So they're quite happy to say, yes, I'm not very good at using Excel. Yes, I'm not very good at making presentations. Yes, in that meeting last week, I believe I did make the wrong decision. And they don't say because. So they don't blame people. They don't make excuses. There is no vagueness. They're very explicit about it. And it's been shown that even in one-to-one personal relationships, admitting mistakes is one of the things that leads to longer lasting, deeper relationships with individuals. So this is not just a business acumen skill. One of the things that we see as well is that people who demonstrate high self-awareness when admitting mistakes also avoid the use of 2 phrases or 1 word and 1 phrase. They typically make much less use, frequently no use, of yes, but and why. So if they're given feedback, they don't say something like, yes, but of course in my position I have to do that, or yes, but on that occasion it was appropriate. And they also, when given feedback and people say things like, you know, I felt uncomfortable last time when we met, they don't ask the aggressive why. There's 2 types of why. There's the aggressive why and there's what I call the Princess Diana why. People with high levels of self-awareness do ask why, because that's a way of learning, but they do it in a much more self-deprecating way. They ask, why? Why would you say that? Why would you think that? People who lack self-awareness will frequently ask why in a much more aggressive way. Why? And you can almost hear in their head that little bit on the end, which is why. Are you stupid or something? So it's really important, if you want to improve your self-awareness, think about feedback you've been given. Think about limitations people have highlighted. Think about instances where you've got something wrong and people have informed you. How have you handled it? If you've handled it very positively and constructively, if you've admitted the mistake and then applied the other behaviors I mentioned earlier, seeking the feedback, seeking to understand, two things will happen. One is the strength of your relationship will develop with the individuals concerned. And secondly, they'll bring information to you quicker and more thought through in the future. If you resist feedback, and if you argue against mistakes, if you deny them, you will progressively receive less feedback, less information, and become more isolated. And in our current virtual world, that is actually critically important. So a rhetorical question back to you. How often do you admit mistakes, and how often do you actively seek to learn from them? So those are our 4 behaviors. Those are the anchor behaviors, which in our research we found really characterize the people with high levels of self-awareness. The self-awareness comes from the quaternion profile. For those of you who are not familiar with that, it's a competency model made up of 4 components. Management, which is about making things happen. Business acumen, which is about the skills that enable you to make great decisions and make good business decisions. So things like risk-taking, negotiation, etc. Leadership, which is about creating a vision, inspiring and creating the resources to deliver it. And then personal effectiveness. Even if you've got leadership skills, management skills, and business acumen, if you can't build relationships with people, then you're going to struggle. And that's where self-awareness really comes in. So demonstrating self-awareness is the second in the personal effectiveness element, or dimension rather, in the quaternion profile. We are going to be sending you a copy of the quaternion profile following this webinar. We'll also be sending you a PDF of the slide deck. We'll also be including an offer for you if you wanted to have sessions run in your company. We're offering a choice of 4 sessions which will run free of charge as part of our contribution to coming out of COVID-19. So if you'd like to take that opportunity, the links are on the screen now, but they will be in the handout that we sent to you. And we'll be just sending you some basic information around the rest of the model. So at this point, I'm just going to have a look, see if I've received any questions through the chat, which I don't see that we've received any. So I'm going to thank you all for attending. Our next webinar in the series is on the 31st of July at 2 p.m. BST, 31st of July, 2 p.m. That webinar is going to be on virtual professionalism. We're detecting that the Zoom novelty is wearing off, that people are starting to be much more analytical and questioning around the effectiveness, etc. So on July the 31st, we'll be sharing a range of skills with you, quite a list of how do you look, how do you sound, and how do you act professionally when you're working in a virtual world. So it's complementary to the Virtual Impact Program that we run last month. So we look forward to joining you. I just see a question. So I've got a question from Helen. How do you respond to feedback depending on who it is? That's a great question, Helen. And actually what I'll do is we've got we've got actually a handout. It's a white paper on handling feedback, responding to feedback. So what I'll do, Helen, I'll include that with the materials that we send out following the webinar. So all of you will get that. It talks about the different ways in which you can actually respond when you get feedback. So thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. I hope you stay safe, stay well. We're about to face, I think, the more exciting phase, which is coming out of COVID-19. I think it's going to present us as managers with more challenges than going in did. I'm delighted to be running some of these webinars and hopefully providing you with ideas that you can use. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you on the 31st of July. The registration details will be in the email we send you, which will probably come out to you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I'm just seeing the comments coming up. Thanks, everyone, for those. Yeah, and again, we really welcome you to come back. Thank you for those of you who've joined us again. All of those who've joined us for the first time, I hope you found this useful. Again, we'll be sending all of you the handouts and the offer that we made, and I look forward to the 31st of July. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.